Today I have for you a spectacular game from round 1 of the Chessable Masters Final, in which the world's #1 player Magnus Carlsen utterly annihilates the world's #3 Hikaru Nakamura, landing him in a totally lost position after only 14 moves. How does he do this? Well, he starts with a Jobava London opening and then proceeds to execute a virtually engine-perfect attack, tearing the position open and going straight for the king. Hikaru holds on for dear life, but when Magnus is firing on all cylinders, as he is in this game, there really are no second chances. So let's dive right in. Magnus Carlsen has the white pieces, and he gets this soiree swinging with d4. Hikaru responds symmetrically with d5, and from Magnus, we have knight to c3, the Chigorin variation, which is traditionally not considered ideal for white as it blocks the c-pawn from being pushed to c4, but it's been getting played a bit more often in recent times due to the rise in popularity of the opening system that Magnus employs after Hikaru's next move, knight to f6, which is bishop to f4, known as the Jobava London system. This gives white the potential for an early attack on the c7 pawn with the move knight to b5, unless of course black prevents it, as Hikaru now does with the move a6. c6 is playable as well, but most players prefer to retain the possibility of getting that c-pawn to c5 in just one move. Magnus continues e3, to which Hikaru responds h6, which might look a bit odd, but believe it or not, this is actually the top choice of Stockfish at a search depth of 53. So why exactly Hikaru played it, I couldn't tell you, but I can tell you that the reason Stockfish likes it is that after black plays e6, it's worried about g4 and g5 from white. So it's trying to discourage that. But Magnus now has an interesting response. He plays h4, which seems to indicate that he may have thought Hikaru was planning to play g5, and who knows, maybe he was. Play continues e6 and knight to f3, bringing us to another interesting moment where Hikaru plays the relatively unusual b6, preparing a queenside bishop fianchetto while supporting a possible c5. Looks pretty reasonable, aside from the fact that this is now pawn move number 5 for Hikaru, so he's sacrificing some piece development here in order to achieve his ideal pawn structure, or so it seems. Not something I would advise that you try at home. Magnus responds to this with the top engine move, knight to e5, posting his knight on a beautiful central square and preparing to activate his queen toward the king side with queen to f3 next, since that's where he believes his best attacking prospects lie. And now here's a question. If you had this position as black and you wanted to challenge that white knight on e5 within, let's say, 1 to 3 moves, how would you do it? I'll bet that most of you can come up with a better method than Hikaru now does. A lot of the time in chess, the most obvious plan is the best plan. So here, you're going to want to play bishop to b7 to guard c6. You don't want to start with an immediate knight b to d7, since after knight to c6, oops-a-daisy, you just lost your queen, who is trapped. So bishop to b7 first, then you can play knight b to d7, maybe capture on e5, maybe not. Either way, you'll be able to play c5 with approximate equality. But Hikaru decides to challenge the e5 knight right away with the move knight f to d7, to which Magnus responds queen to f3, developing his fourth piece and doing what every chess beginner is taught to do in the opening. You know, get your pieces out, don't make any more pawn moves than is necessary, while Hikaru is in flagrant violation of these principles, having moved his only developed piece now twice in addition to his 5 pawn moves. So this is very risky business, but if anyone can get away with such a thing, it's gonna be Hikaru or Magnus. Knight takes e5 is next. It is the best move, since after bishop takes e5, Hikaru does get to play knight to d7 with tempo on that e5 bishop, which Magnus does need to take a move to retreat, since there's really no good reason to allow black the knight for bishop trade here. So we have bishop to f4, and what do you think Hikaru does now? Do you think he deviates from his apparent commitment to only moving his knights and pawns? Not yet, because here comes pawn move number 6 with c5. But it's all good. The engine approves, more or less. I mean, it's not excited about black's position. White does now have a non-trivial advantage, as demonstrated by Magnus's strong response, queen to g3, preventing black from developing his dark-squared bishop now in two different ways, the most significant of which is not the threat of queen takes g7 in response to bishop e7, but rather bishop to c7, trapping the black queen. And this move queen to g3 would not have been any good for white if black still had a knight on f6, since then there would be knight to h5, forking queen and bishop. If he tries it now, then bishop to c7 is still good, since it will win the pawn on b6. So what's played is bishop to b7, Magnus castles queenside, at which point Hikaru's position, not unlike a flock of geese in late September, is about to go south. Black only really has one good move here, which Hikaru doesn't play. Pause the video if you'd like, and see if you can determine what that is. What black needs to play is knight to f6. And you might ask, does this not still lose the b-pawn to bishop to c7? Well, yes it does, but after queen to d7 and bishop takes b6, black can get some compensation in the form of some quick piece activity with the move bishop to d6. And because bishop to b7 has been played, queen takes g7 is no longer good for white, after king to e7, threatening to trap the queen with rook a to g8, to which white has no good defense, and the queen cannot escape. Therefore, taking on g7 here is no good. White would need to play something else, after which black can play c4, when white's bishop is looking kind of stranded over here on b6, with the engine giving approximate equality. But in the game, after Magnus castles, Hikaru decides to try rook to c8, preventing bishop to c7, probably planning knight to f6 next, to which Magnus responds with another move that I invite you to find, but you'll have to be quick because here it comes. It's the engine perfect e4, right out of AlphaZero's playbook. Let's use our pawns to break open the position and severely chastise black for neglecting his development, leaving his king in the center for too long, and missing his chance to equalize with the move knight to f6, which would have been good for black for a couple of different reasons. First of all, it would threaten that move knight to h5, forking queen and bishop, and it would also add support to the d5 pawn while opening the queen's eyes to the center, which might seem a bit sketchy with the white rook lurking here on d1, but I'm going to be showing you a variation where this actually works in black's favor. Okay, so Hikaru continues with the best move in his now borderline losing position with c takes d4. If he were to instead play d takes e4, then d5 is very powerful, threatening to break things open further with d takes e6, and if e takes d5, then knight takes d5 is very nasty, threatening knight to c7 check, or worse yet, bishop to c7, and where is the black queen going? Nowhere. You'll have to give up the exchange with rook takes c7. So this line is just the end of the line for black. Bishop takes d5 doesn't help after rook takes d5, the d7 knight is pinned, a6 is under fire, black still can't develop his dark squared bishop in view of queen takes g7. So, anywho, Hikaru avoids this, and instead plays c takes d4. At which point Magnus, glancing down at his wristband that bears the letters WWSD, which for those of you who don't know stands for What Would Stockfish Do, now heeds that gentle reminder with a very brilliant move. If you want to try to spot it, go ahead, have a gander, and after carefully pondering the position, if you say rook takes d4, then congratulations, you found white's second best move. But if you said e takes d5, then at least for this one move, your board vision is functionally equal to that of Magnus Carlsen's, who realized, as did Hikaru, that this beautiful offering of his knight on c3 should not be accepted. For if pawn takes knight on c3, there would follow d takes e6, attacking the d7 knight, which is now pinned and must be lost. Now black can throw in c takes b2 with check. That's no problem. White will just play king to b1, removing defense from the rook on d1. So if you can imagine that black had played knight to f6 a few moves ago, like we talked about, then you'll see that this whole variation wouldn't have worked for white, since after this move king to b1 or king takes b2, then black could win the rook on d1 with the queen. But now for the obvious question, why can't black just take the pawn on e6, like so? Well, this actually runs into a checkmate in 2 with queen to g6 check, king to e7, and bishop to d6 checkmate. Very lovely. But Hikaru is not one to miss something like this, and so in the game, realizing that the knight on c3 is taboo, and also realizing that Magnus is threatening d takes e6, followed by queen to g6 check, among other things, decides to now try knight to f6, which unfortunately, after only 14 moves, throws him into a full-blown lost position. What he needed to play here was queen to f6. Maybe he didn't like the looks of knight to e4 attacking his queen, but then he could respond queen to f5, and white is still much better, but there is some hope for black. Since white should not now play d takes e6, since after f takes e6, black has actually equalized. He's threatening to take the knight on c3, the black queen is guarding against queen to g6 check, the knight on d7 is helping to prevent bishop to e5. So let's contrast that with Hikaru's move, after e takes d5, which is knight to f6. Now, Magnus's response d takes e6 is a whole nother story. Black's d-pawn is pinned, so he's not threatening to win the knight on c3, and white is about to attack that d-pawn with bishop to e5. Black can't add any defense. If bishop to c5, well, there's still the little problem of queen takes g7. So Hikaru is in big trouble, but he's not ready to throw in the towel just yet, and after 2.5 minutes of thought, he plays the move knight to h5, achieving that fork of queen and bishop, but sadly it's much too late. Magnus responds queen to g4, a ruthlessly accurate move. He could just take on f7 with check, but he wants a commitment out of Hikaru's knight first, since if it were to go back to f6, then taking on f7 might actually help the black king get a bit safer, hiding behind that knight, and black would still be totally losing, but Magnus is waiting for knight takes f4, which is what Hikaru plays next, and only now does he play e takes f7 check. Hikaru recaptures with the king. There's really nothing better. Now Magnus gets to capture on f4 with check. Hikaru puts his queen in the way. The black king is now reasonably safe, but unfortunately the d-pawn is not, and it now falls to rook takes d4. Magnus is now 2 pawns up, and he's threatening things like rook to d7 check, winning the bishop on b7, or bishop to c4 check. So Hikaru decides to trade queens. It can't really be avoided anyway, since his queen is pinned to the king. And so after queen takes f4 check, rook takes f4 check, and king to e8, we now have a simplified position which offers Hikaru very little hope of survival due to his material deficit, but he does have the 2 bishops in a wide open position, so he decides to play on for a bit, hoping for a miracle. We have bishop to d3 from Magnus, rook to c7, guarding that 7th rank, maybe anticipating bishop to g6 check, followed by rook to f7, but Magnus continues rook to e1 check, and after king to d8, wastes no time in playing bishop to e4. He wants to get a pair of bishops off the board, since having a knight versus only 1 bishop is generally preferable to facing the bishop pair, whose combined value is considered to be worth at least a half a pawn more than twice the value of a single bishop. Hikaru avoids the trade with bishop to c8, but after Magnus insists with bishop to f5, Hikaru realizes that the bishop trade is unavoidable, for if he were to move his bishop back to b7 now, then rook to d4 check would actually mate in 10 moves, because where's the king going? Nowhere. Black can only throw pieces in the way. So Hikaru, with what I imagine must be a heavy heart, plays bishop takes f5, and after rook takes f5, it's just a matter of mopping up for Magnus. We have bishop to c5 attacking f2, knight to e4, defending while attacking the attacker, so the bishop drops back to e7, attacking h4, g3 defends, king to c8 gets off the open file, rook to e5 sets up a potential rook battery, and after rook to d8 and rook to d1, looking for a rook trade, Hikaru says no thanks and plays rook to f8. We have c3, maybe looking to get the king active at some point via the light squares, g5, h takes g5, h takes g5, rook to d2, adding some defense to f2, g4, putting that pawn on lockdown, maybe bishop to g5 will be possible at some point, rook to e6 attacks b6, king to b7 defends, rook to g6 attacks the g-pawn, which can't be defended, so Hikaru goes for some queenside action now with b5. We have rook takes g4, b4 hitting that pinned c-pawn, king to c2, b takes c3, b takes c3, rook to f5, looking for some lateral activity. Next is a4, rook to a5, king to b3, defending a4, king to a7, preparing rook to b7 check. Magnus responds rook to d4, adding defense to a4. Next is rook to b7 check, king to c2, bishop to a3, maybe looking for rook to b2 check. Not that it's really going to do anything. Magnus plays king to d3, and after rook to h5, headed to h1, he takes aim at that a6 pawn with rook to g6. We have rook to h1 and king to e2, guarding some squares. Rook to a1, eyeing a4. Rook to c4, perhaps preparing to double up on the a6 pawn. Rook to e7, pins the knight to the king. King to f3 unpins. Bishop to b2 clears the way for rook takes a4. If white were to now play rook c to c6. Magnus doesn't, he goes for knight to c5 instead, threatening rook takes a6 check, to which there is no defense. Magnus is about to pick up Hikaru's last remaining pawn, which is enough to convince him to call it a day, and Hikaru Nakamura resigns the game. So, always a pleasure to watch these old rivals go at it on the 64 squares, especially when Magnus has engine mode engaged and Hikaru is in dubious opening mode. So thank you yet again for joining me here today. Please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already, and or hitting that like button and commenting with anything that's on your mind. And I will see you next time.